The riverside storage facility sat baking under the Arizona sun, its endless rows of metal units hiding decades of forgotten lives. Margaret Chen adjusted her baseball cap and watched her husband Paul cut the lock on Unit 47. They'd paid $300 for the contents, sight unseen, a retirement hobby that usually netted them dusty furniture and old Christmas decorations. But today felt different. The unit rolled open to reveal hundreds of pristine hiking backpacks stacked floor to ceiling. "Jackpot," Paul whispered. That's when Rex, their German shepherd, started digging frantically behind the wall of bags, his claws scraping against concrete. What he dragged out made Margaret's blood freeze, a black duffel bag that shouldn't exist, filled with evidence from cases she'd worked 15 years ago as a federal agent. Cases involving people who were supposed to be dead. The cartel money was one thing, but the recent surveillance photos of their own house, that changed everything. Someone had been watching them long before they bought this unit. But why were Margaret's old enemies storing evidence in a random storage facility, and how did they know the retired DEA agent would find it? Margaret's hands trembled as she rifled through the photographs. Her morning coffee routine, Paul watering their desert garden, Rex chasing rabbits in their backyard, all taken with a telephoto lens, all dated within the past month. The professional quality made her stomach turn. Whoever was behind this had resources and patience. "Maggie?" Paul's voice seemed to come from underwater. "What is it?" She couldn't answer. Not yet. Her eyes had found something worse buried beneath the surveillance photos. Crime scene images she remembered from Operation Desert Viper, her final case before retirement. Bodies arranged in the desert, execution style. The signature brutality of the Hermanos Sangre cartel. But these weren't the photos from her official files. These were different angles taken by someone else who'd been there, someone on the inside. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She'd always suspected there was a leak in the task force, someone feeding information to Eduardo Vasquez and his organization. Despite their best efforts, the cartel had stayed 2 steps ahead of every raid, every arrest warrant, every attempt to dismantle their Phoenix distribution network. When Vasquez allegedly died in a car bombing in Tijuana, the investigation had closed with too many loose ends. "Margaret." Paul's voice was sharper now. He'd moved closer, close enough to see the cash bundles stacked beneath the photographs. "What the hell is this?" She forced herself to meet his eyes. Paul had been her anchor through 23 years of marriage, 15 of them spent watching her come home from crime scenes that would give normal people nightmares. He deserved the truth, but the truth might get them both killed. "It's from my old cases," she said quietly. "Someone wants me to know they've been watching us." Paul's face went pale under his farmer's tan. "The cartel cases? I thought those were finished." "So did I." Margaret pulled out her phone, then hesitated. Who could she call? Her old supervisor had retired to Florida. Half the task force had transferred to other offices. The other half, well, she was beginning to suspect at least one of them had never really been on her side. Rex whined and pawed at the concrete where he'd found the bag. Margaret knelt beside him, running her fingers along the floor. There, barely visible under decades of dust, were scratch marks. Someone had pried up the concrete, buried the bag, and carefully concealed their work. This wasn't a random hiding spot. This storage unit had been chosen specifically. "We need to leave," she said, standing abruptly. "Now, what about the backpacks? We paid for them, and they're worth—" "Paul." Her voice carried the authority that had once commanded respect in federal task force meetings. "Look around. Really look." He did, and she watched understanding dawn on his face. The backpacks weren't random inventory. They were identical models, military grade, the kind used for smuggling operations across the border. Hundreds of them, pristine and waiting. This wasn't someone's abandoned storage unit. This was an active supply depot. And somehow, through the random chaos of a storage auction, she and Paul had just walked into the middle of an ongoing operation. Margaret's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Welcome back to the game, Agent Chen. Hope you enjoyed retirement while it lasted." She showed Paul the message. watching his face cycle through confusion, anger, and fear. 37 years of marriage, and she'd never seen him look so frightened. "They know we found it," she whispered. Another text arrived, "The house or the evidence. Choose quickly." Margaret stared at the screen, her mind racing through 15 years of investigations, searching for a pattern she'd missed. Someone had orchestrated this entire scenario. The storage auction, Unit 47, even Rex's discovery, none of it was coincidence. They weren't just in danger. They were pieces in someone else's game, and the rules had just changed. The storage unit smelled like dust and forgotten dreams when Margaret Chen pulled up the metal door the next morning. Rows of backpacks stretched before them like a fabric army. Hiking packs, school bags, designer knockoffs, and military surplus gear. Her husband, David, whistled low as he stepped inside, running his hand through his graying hair. "Jesus, Maggie. There's got to be 300 bags in here." Margaret nodded, already calculating resale values in her head. After 23 years with the DEA, retirement had been an adjustment. The adrenaline rush of raids and investigations had given way to farmers' markets and storage unit auctions. Not exactly what she'd imagined for her golden years, but the treasure hunting aspect scratched a familiar itch. Previous owner must have been planning to start a retail business, she said, examining a pristine North Face knockoff. "Look at the variety. Different brands, different sizes. This is organized inventory, not personal stuff." David hefted a large camping pack, checking the zippers and straps. "Quality's good too. We could easily get $15 to $20 each for these online. Maybe more for the name brands." Their German Shepherd, Ranger, trotted into the unit behind them, nose immediately going to work. The dog had been a gift from Margaret's former colleagues, a retired K9 whose handler had moved overseas. Ranger had taken to civilian life better than Margaret had, though his training never really switched off. "Easy there, boy," Margaret said as Ranger began sniffing intensely around the back corner of the unit. "Nothing exciting here, just old backpacks." But Ranger wasn't listening. His tail had gone rigid, and he was pawing at something behind a stack of duffel bags. Margaret frowned. She'd seen that posture before, back when Ranger was still working cases. "David, come look at this." Her husband appeared beside her as she moved the bags aside. Ranger had uncovered what looked like a ventilation grate in the concrete wall, though it seemed oddly placed. Too low and too far from any actual ventilation system. "That's weird," David muttered. "Why would there be a grate there?" Margaret knelt down, her fingers tracing the edges. The screws were loose, recently disturbed. Her pulse quickened with a familiar sensation she hadn't felt in months. "Hand me that screwdriver from the truck. Maggie, we shouldn't be. Just get it." The grate came away easily, revealing a hollow space carved into the wall behind it. Ranger immediately stuck his nose into the opening, tail wagging with excitement. Margaret reached inside and felt fabric, heavy canvas that definitely didn't belong to the building's construction. "There's something in here." She pulled carefully, and a black military-style duffel bag emerged. It was heavier than expected, and as it hit the concrete floor, she heard the unmistakable sound of bundled paper sliding around inside. David stepped back instinctively. "That doesn't look like storage unit inventory." Margaret's hands hovered over the zipper. Every instinct told her to call this in, contact her former colleagues, walk away. But curiosity had always been both her greatest strength and her most dangerous weakness as an agent. The zipper opened smoothly, and David sucked in a sharp breath. Stacks and stacks of $100 bills, bound with rubber bands and packed tight. But that wasn't what made Margaret's blood run cold. Tucked between the money bundles were photographs, 8x10 glossy prints that she recognized immediately from her DEA days. Execution photos. Bodies in various states of dismemberment, some still wearing blindfolds, others clearly tortured before death. The backgrounds showed desert landscapes she'd seen in dozens of case files. "Mexican cartel territory. We need to leave. Now." Margaret's voice was steady, but her hands were already rezipping the bag. "What is it? What's in the photos?" "Nothing you want to see." She hefted the bag, mind racing through possibilities. The storage unit auction had been legitimate, she'd verified that much, but whoever had rented this space originally had been using it for more than retail inventory storage. We're taking this home, and then I'm making some calls. Shouldn't we just turn it in to the police? Margaret paused in the doorway, scanning the parking lot with practiced eyes. A white sedan sat 2 spaces down that hadn't been there when they'd arrived. Tinted windows, engine running, professional surveillance, but not law enforcement. She knew the difference. Too late for that, she said quietly. Load up as many backpacks as you can. Act normal. Don't look toward that white car. David's face went pale, but he followed instructions. Margaret's retirement had officially ended the moment she'd opened that bag. The question now was whether they'd live long enough for her to figure out how to handle it. As they drove away, the white sedan pulled out 3 cars behind them. The photographs spread across their kitchen table like a grotesque deck of cards, each one more brutal than the last. Margaret forced herself to examine every detail, her DEA training overriding the revulsion churning in her stomach. David had retreated to the living room after the 3rd photo, claiming he needed to check the security system, but she knew better. 23 years of marriage had taught her to recognize when her accountant husband hit his limit with violence. Rex sat at her feet, his ears alert, occasionally whining as if he could sense the evil emanating from the images. Margaret counted 12 photographs total, each showing a different victim. The execution style was consistent: single gunshot to the back of the head, bodies positioned kneeling, professional, cold. The backgrounds varied: a warehouse, what looked like a desert location, an underground parking garage. But it was the 13th photograph that made her blood freeze. Unlike the others, this one showed a man very much alive, seated in what appeared to be an upscale restaurant. He was middle-aged, Hispanic, wearing an expensive suit and gold watch. His smile was warm as he raised a wine glass toward the camera. Someone had drawn a red X over his face with what looked like a marker and written next in block letters across the bottom. Margaret recognized him immediately. Carlos Mendoza, a prominent Phoenix businessman who owned a chain of auto dealerships. She'd seen his commercials on television just last week. The man who promised to put you in your dream car at a dream price. What she hadn't seen was any mention of his death in the news. She grabbed her laptop from the counter, her fingers flying across the keyboard. The search results confirmed her growing dread. Carlos Mendoza had been reported missing 3 days ago by his wife when he failed to return home from a business dinner. The police were calling it a missing person case, not a homicide. They didn't know about the photograph. We need to call the FBI, tonight. Margaret, this isn't just drug money and old evidence. This is an active operation. Look. She turned the laptop screen toward him, showing Mendoza's missing person article alongside his photograph. This man disappeared 3 days ago. 3 days. We're holding evidence of crimes that are happening right now. David sank into the chair across from her, running his hands through his graying hair. Jesus Christ, what have we gotten ourselves into? Before she could answer, Rex bolted upright, his body rigid. A low growl rumbled from his throat as he stared toward the front of the house. Margaret felt every muscle in her body tense. In the 18 months since they'd adopted the retired police dog, she'd learned to trust his instincts completely. "What is it, boy?" David whispered. Rex moved toward the living room, his movements deliberate and controlled, the same way he'd behaved during his years detecting drugs and explosives for the Phoenix PD. Margaret motioned for David to stay put as she followed the dog, staying low and keeping to the shadows. The living room's large picture window faced their quiet cul-de-sac. Through the blinds, she could see the familiar outlines of their neighbors' houses, the streetlights casting pools of yellow light on the empty asphalt. Everything looked normal, too normal. Then she saw it. A dark sedan parked at the corner, just outside the reach of the nearest streetlight. The engine was off, but she could make out the faint glow of someone's phone or cigarette inside. In 12 years of living on Mesquite Circle, she'd never seen that car before. Rex's growl deepened. Margaret backed away from the window, her mind racing through possibilities. It could be nothing, a teenager sneaking out, someone making a private phone call, a rideshare driver waiting for a pickup. But every instinct honed by 15 years of undercover work screamed otherwise. She pulled her phone from her pocket, fingers hovering over the emergency contact she'd hoped never to use. Special Agent Sarah Vega had been her partner during the final years of her DEA career and now worked organized crime for the FBI's Phoenix field office. Sarah would take this seriously. Sarah would know what to do. But calling meant crossing a line they couldn't uncross. Once she made that call, their quiet retirement would be over. They'd become witnesses, maybe targets, definitely complications in whatever investigation was already underway. The sedan's engine started, and the car pulled away slowly, its headlights never turning on. Margaret dialed Sarah's number. The morning sun cast long shadows across the storage facility as Margaret stood before Unit 247, keys trembling slightly in her hand. She'd barely slept, her mind cycling through scenarios that grew progressively darker with each passing hour. David had wanted to come with her, but she'd convinced him to stay home with Zeus, partly for his safety, mostly because she needed to think clearly without his nervous energy feeding her own anxiety. The metal door rolled up with its familiar screech, revealing the sea of backpacks that had seemed like such a windfall just yesterday. Now they looked ominous, like silent witnesses to something she wasn't sure she wanted to understand. Margaret pulled on latex gloves, old habits from her DEA days, and began her methodical search. She started with the backpacks nearest to where Zeus had found the duffel bag, running her hands along seams, checking hidden pockets, feeling for anything unusual. The first dozen yielded nothing but dust and the occasional candy wrapper. But as she worked deeper into the unit, patterns began to emerge that made her stomach clench. Many of the backpacks showed subtle signs of wear in specific places, straps slightly stretched, bottom panels with faint residue that could have been anything but probably wasn't. More telling were the nearly invisible modifications, reinforced seams, false bottoms that had been expertly resealed, and tiny holes in the lining where tracking devices might have been inserted. Margaret's phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "Hope you enjoyed your shopping trip yesterday." Her blood turned to ice. She screenshot the message immediately, then called David. "Pack a bag," she said without preamble when he picked up. "We're leaving. Now." "What?" "Margaret, what's—" "They know about the storage unit. They know we were there. I just got a text." The line went quiet except for David's sharp intake of breath. "I'll be ready in 10 minutes. Margaret's hands worked faster now, no longer methodical but urgent. In the back corner, behind a stack of pristine hiking backpacks, she found what she was looking for, or, rather, what she'd hoped she wouldn't find. A small notebook, spiral-bound, with entries that made her former DEA training kick into high gear. The pages contained dates, locations, and numbers that followed the unmistakable pattern of a trafficking schedule. Routes through Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas, drop-off points with GPS coordinates, payment amounts that made the $2 million in the duffel bag look like pocket change, and names, some crossed out in red ink with dates beside them that could only mean one thing. The last entry was dated 3 weeks ago, Phoenix pickup compromised, Mr. and JL eliminated, relocating operation. Margaret photographed every page, her training overriding her fear. This wasn't just evidence of trafficking, this was documentation of an entire network, possibly one she'd been hunting during her years with the DEA without knowing it. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was a call from the same unknown number. She almost didn't answer. Almost. But 25 years of law enforcement had taught her that information was power, and right now she needed all the power she could get. "Hello, Margaret." The voice was calm, pleasant even, with a slight accent she couldn't immediately place. "I believe you have something that belongs to me. I don't know what you're talking about." A soft laugh, the storage unit, the backpacks, the very interesting black bag your dog found. Shall I continue? Margaret's mind raced. How could they possibly know about Zeus finding the bag unless you're watching us? I'm a businessman, Margaret. I protect my investments. That storage unit contained inventory worth considerably more than the $500 you paid for it. The DEA will take months to build a case, assuming they believe a retired agent who's been out of the game for 3 years. I, on the other hand, am considerably more immediate in my problem-solving approach. Margaret thought of the crossed-out names in the notebook. What do you want? A simple exchange. The bag and its contents, plus anything else you might have found, for your continued peaceful retirement. You and David have such a lovely home. It would be a shame if anything happened to it, or to Zeus. The threat to her dog made something cold and hard crystallize in Margaret's chest. Where? Much better. There's a rest stop on I-10, mile marker 112. Today, sunset. Come alone, bring everything, and this unfortunate misunderstanding will be resolved. The line went dead. Margaret stared at the phone, her mind already working through possibilities. She could call her former supervisor, Agent Richardson, but the caller was right. It would take time to mobilize any official response, time she probably didn't have. She could run, but people with this kind of operation had long reaches and longer memories. Or she could fall back on what she knew best, being a DEA agent. Margaret pocketed the notebook and pulled out her phone to call Richardson anyway, because if she was walking into a trap tonight, someone needed to know where to start looking for answers. Margaret's phone buzzed at 5:47 a.m., dragging her from the first peaceful sleep she'd managed in 3 days. The caller ID made her stomach clench. Detective Ray Kowalski, her former partner from the DEA task force. Chen, we need to talk. Now. She slipped out of bed, careful not to wake David, and padded to the kitchen. What's wrong? 3 bodies turned up in a warehouse in Riverside last night. Execution style. Sound familiar? Margaret's grip tightened on the phone. The photos from the duffel bag flashed through her mind. The same methodical positioning, the same signature wound patterns. How did you? Because someone's been asking questions about you. The kind of questions that make people nervous. My CI says there's chatter about a retired Fed who stumbled onto something she shouldn't have. The coffee mug slipped from Margaret's other hand, shattering on the tile floor. David appeared in the doorway, instantly alert despite his disheveled appearance. Where? She asked. Meet me at the old diner on Route 9. 1 hour. And Chen? What's your back getting there? The line went dead. Margaret stared at the phone, her mind racing through contingencies she'd hoped never to use again. What's happening? David's voice carried the strain of the past few days. We need to leave. Right now. They dressed in silence, the practiced efficiency of a couple who'd weathered crises before. Margaret checked the Glock hidden in her nightstand drawer, ensuring a round was chambered. The weight felt both foreign and familiar after years of retirement. Rex whined at the back door, sensing the tension. Margaret clipped his leash, knowing she couldn't leave him vulnerable. Whatever was coming, they'd face it together. The drive to Route 9 took them through industrial areas where shadows seemed deeper than they should. Margaret varied her route twice, checking mirrors obsessively. A black SUV appeared in her peripheral vision 3 blocks from home, maintaining distance but matching every turn. Company, she murmured, watching David's jaw tighten. She took a sharp right into a strip mall parking lot, circling behind a 24-hour laundromat. The SUV continued straight, but Margaret caught a glimpse of the driver. Latino male, mid-30s, wearing sunglasses despite the early hour. Professional surveillance, she said. They're not trying to be invisible. Meaning, they want us to know we're being watched. Ray was already seated in a back booth when they arrived, his weathered face grim. He'd aged since Margaret's retirement, grey threading through his black hair, new lines etched around his eyes. A steaming cup of coffee sat untouched before him. Margaret slid across from him while David took the adjacent booth, positioning himself to watch the entrance. Rex settled at Margaret's feet, alert but calm. "Talk to me," Margaret said. Ray pulled out a tablet, swiping to a crime scene photo. Recognize the handiwork? The image made Margaret's blood run cold. 3 bodies arranged in a perfect triangle, hands zip-tied behind their backs, single gunshot wounds to the base of the skull, identical to the photos from the duffel bag. Los Hermanos, she whispered. The Morales cartel's enforcement arm. They've been expanding operations along the I-40 corridor, using storage facilities as distribution hubs. Word is someone compromised one of their safe houses. Margaret felt the weight of inevitable consequence settling on her shoulders. They think I'm working an active case. Are you? Ray, I bought a goddamn storage unit. I'm supposed to be selling backpacks on eBay. Well, now you're in the middle of a war between Los Hermanos and the Valdez organization. Both sides think you have intelligence that could tip the balance. David leaned forward from the next booth. What kind of intelligence? Ray's expression darkened. Financial records, supplier contacts, territory maps, the kind of information that's worth killing for, the kind that could bring down entire networks. Margaret thought about the duffel bag hidden in their garage, the thick envelope of documents she'd barely examined. How much time do we have? Hours, maybe less. My source says there's a contract out. 50,000 for information leading to recovery of stolen cartel property. Another 100,000 for the person who took it. The diner's bell chimed as new customers entered. 2 men in casual clothing who moved with predatory awareness. Margaret noted their positions, the way they scanned the room before selecting a table with clear sightlines. Back exit? She asked quietly. Through the kitchen. But Margaret, running won't solve this. These people are patient and they're thorough. Eventually they'll find you. Margaret studied her former partner's face, reading the subtext in his expression. Unless we end it first. I've got federal resources, but I need something to work with. Evidence, names, anything that gives us leverage. The 2 men at the front table were watching now, their pretense of casual dining abandoned. Margaret felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that preceded violence. Then we'd better move fast, she said, standing slowly. Because I think our window just closed. The security footage from the storage facility played on Margaret's laptop screen in grainy black and white. She'd convinced the manager, Mrs. Patterson, to let her review the recordings by flashing her retired DEA credentials and spinning a story about missing family heirlooms. The woman had been surprisingly cooperative, perhaps intimidated by Margaret's authoritative demeanor. Margaret fast-forwarded through hours of empty corridors until movement caught her eye. She slowed the playback, watching a figure approach Unit 247, their unit. The timestamp showed 3 days ago, just 2 days after they'd purchased the contents at auction. The person wore dark clothing and a baseball cap pulled low, making identification impossible. They spent less than 5 minutes at the unit before disappearing from frame. Margaret rewound and watched again, noting how the figure moved with purpose, checking over their shoulder repeatedly. Professional paranoia. She'd seen it countless times in her career. Her phone buzzed with a text from Robert, taking Zeus to the vet. Something's wrong. Margaret's blood chilled. She tried calling, but it went straight to voicemail. Zeus had been fine that morning, his usual energetic self. The timing felt too convenient, too coincidental. She grabbed her keys and headed for the parking lot, her mind racing through possibilities. The cartel could have poisoned Zeus, or worse. They could be using the vet visit as a way to separate her and Robert, making them easier targets. The veterinary clinic was only 10 minutes away, but traffic made it feel like an eternity. Margaret's hands gripped the steering wheel as she ran through tactical scenarios. If this was an ambush, Robert would be vulnerable, distracted by concern for their dog. She pulled into the clinic parking lot and immediately spotted Robert's SUV. Through the large windows, she could see him in the waiting room, Zeus lying at his feet. The dog appeared alert, though subdued. Margaret exhaled slowly, some of the tension leaving her shoulders. Inside, the receptionist directed her to examination room 3. Robert looked up as she entered, relief flooding his features. "Thank God you're here," he said. "Zeus started acting strange about an hour ago, whimpering, refusing food, hiding under the kitchen table." Dr. Reeves, a tall man with kind eyes, was examining Zeus's gums and checking his pupils with a small flashlight. "His vitals are stable, but he's definitely experiencing some distress. Any chance he could have ingested something unusual? Chocolate, medication, household chemicals?" Margaret knelt beside Zeus, running her fingers through his thick coat. The dog leaned into her touch, seeking comfort. "We've been careful. Nothing different in his routine except—" She stopped, a memory surfacing. "Except what?" Robert prompted. "Yesterday morning, when we were moving the backpacks into the garage, Zeus was sniffing around that back corner where we found the duffel bag. I thought he was just curious, but what if there was something else hidden there? Something toxic?" Dr. Reeves frowned. "That's possible. Some drugs, even in small residual amounts, can cause reactions in sensitive animals. Did you notice any unusual substances or odors in that area?" Margaret exchanged a meaningful look with Robert. They couldn't explain about the money and photos without raising questions they weren't prepared to answer. "We bought the contents of a storage unit," Robert said carefully. "It's possible the previous owner stored chemicals or other substances we're not aware of." "I'd like to run some blood work," Dr. Reeves said. "We can test for common toxins. In the meantime, I'll give him something to settle his stomach and keep him comfortable." As the veterinarian prepared the injection, Margaret's phone vibrated with a new message from an unknown number. "Your dog is just the beginning. Return what isn't yours." Her heart hammered against her ribs. She showed the message to Robert, whose face drained of color. "They didn't poison him," she whispered. "They're just letting us know they can get close enough to do it." The threat was clear and terrifying in its restraint. These people had been in their home, near their dog, and chosen to send a warning instead of following through. It demonstrated both capability and patience, hallmarks of professional criminals who understood the value of psychological pressure. Dr. Reeves administered the medication, and Zeus's tail managed a weak wag. "He should feel better within a few hours. Call me immediately if his condition worsens." Margaret helped Robert lift Zeus into the SUV, her eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. The parking lot seemed normal, families with pets, elderly couples, a teenager with a cat carrier, but any of them could be watching, reporting back. "We need to make a decision," she said as they drove home. "We can turn everything over to the FBI and hope they can protect us, or we can try to handle this ourselves." "What do you think?" Robert asked. Margaret watched Zeus in the rearview mirror, the dog's trusting brown eyes meeting hers. Someone had threatened her family, violated the sanctuary of their home. Her protective instincts, honed by years of dangerous work, surged to the surface. "I think," she said quietly, "it's time these people remembered why they should be afraid of us." The morning sun cast long shadows across the Chen's driveway as Margaret loaded Zeus into the back of their Toyota Highlander. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the dog's harness, the events of the past 48 hours weighing heavily on her mind. David emerged from the house carrying a small overnight bag and a thermos of coffee, his face etched with worry lines that seemed to have appeared overnight. "You sure about this?" he asked, sliding into the passenger seat. "We could still call the FBI directly." Margaret started the engine, her jaw set with determination. "Agent Morrison was DEA. If there's corruption involved, we need someone we can trust completely. Sarah's been my partner through hell and back. She'll know what to do." The drive to Sacramento would take 3 hours, giving them time to think and plan. Margaret had called her former partner the night before, using coded language they'd developed during their years working undercover operations. Sarah understood immediately that something was seriously wrong and agreed to meet them at a safe location. As they merged onto Interstate 5, Margaret's rearview mirror became her constant companion. Every sedan, every SUV, every motorcycle that lingered too long behind them sent adrenaline coursing through her veins. The black duffel bag sat hidden beneath Zeus's blanket in the cargo area, its contents potentially worth their lives. "Tell me about the photos again," David said, breaking the tense silence. Margaret's knuckles whitened on the steering wheel, professional execution style, multiple victims, the kind of systematic brutality that comes from high-level cartel operations. She paused, checking the mirror again. The cash was bundled in a specific way too, bank straps still intact, sequential serial numbers. This wasn't street-level dealing money. David pulled out his phone and began scrolling through local news websites. Nothing in the papers about missing DEA agents or compromised investigations. There wouldn't be. When an operation goes dark, it stays dark until they know the scope of the breach. Margaret took the exit toward downtown Sacramento, her training kicking in as she navigated through surface streets, taking random turns to check for surveillance. The predetermined meeting location was a small Vietnamese restaurant in an older part of the city, the kind of place where cash transactions were normal and security cameras were minimal. Margaret parked 2 blocks away, and they walked the remaining distance with Zeus trotting between them. Sarah Huang was already seated in a corner booth, her back to the wall and a clear view of both entrances. Even in civilian clothes, she carried herself with the alertness of someone who'd spent 20 years in federal law enforcement. Her dark eyes locked onto Margaret's the moment they entered. "You look like hell," Sarah said by way of greeting, though her tone carried genuine concern. Margaret slid into the booth across from her. "Feel worse than I look. We've got a problem, Sarah. A big one." Over steaming bowls of pho, Margaret laid out the entire story. The storage unit auction, the hidden duffel bag, Morrison's unexpected visit, and their growing certainty that they'd stumbled into something much larger than a simple drug bust gone wrong. Sarah listened without interruption, her expression growing more serious with each detail. When Margaret finished, she sat back in her chair and exhaled slowly. "The Morrison you described, I know him," Sarah said finally. "Jake Morrison, 15-year veteran, currently assigned to the Los Angeles field office. But here's the thing, Marg. He's been on administrative leave for the past 6 weeks." The blood drained from Margaret's face. "Administrative leave for what?" "Allegedly skimming money from seizures. Internal Affairs has been building a case." Sarah leaned forward, lowering her voice. "If he came to your house in an official capacity, he was operating outside his authority." David set down his spoon with a sharp clink. "So he wasn't there to collect evidence. He was there to retrieve stolen money. Which means the photos might document his own crew's activities," Margaret added, the pieces falling into place with sickening clarity. "We're not just witnesses to cartel violence, we're witnesses to federal agents gone rogue." Sarah's phone buzzed with an incoming text. She glanced at it and frowned. "I need to make some calls, but not from here. There's a motel about 10 minutes away, the Desert Inn. Check in under false names and wait for me. Don't use credit cards, don't call anyone, don't go anywhere." As they prepared to leave, Sarah grabbed Margaret's arm. "That money you found, please tell me you didn't leave it at your house." Margaret gestured toward the restaurant's parking lot where Zeus waited in their vehicle. "It's with us." "Good, because if Morrison is dirty, he's not working alone, and $2 million is worth killing for." Sarah's expression hardened. This is about to get very dangerous, very fast. The weight of their situation settled over Margaret like a suffocating blanket as they walked back to their car, every shadow potentially hiding a threat they could no longer identify or trust. The morning sun cast long shadows across the motel parking lot as Margaret checked her watch for the 3rd time in 5 minutes. Agent Rodriguez was late, and every passing car made her pulse quicken. She sat in the passenger seat of David's Honda, the black duffel bag heavy on her lap, while he drummed his fingers nervously against the steering wheel. "Maybe we should have brought Rex," David muttered, scanning the lot. "At least he would have warned us if someone was coming." Margaret shook her head. "He's safer at the kennel. If this goes sideways—" She didn't finish the thought. They both knew the risks. A dark sedan pulled into the lot, moving slowly between the parked cars. Margaret tensed until she recognized Rodriguez behind the wheel. He parked 3 spaces away and approached their vehicle alone, his expression grim. "Mrs. Chen," he nodded as she rolled down the window. "Mr. Chen, I have to say, when I got your call, I thought someone was playing a very dangerous joke." "I wish they were," Margaret replied, lifting the duffel bag. "But this is real enough." Rodriguez glanced around the parking lot before opening the back door and sliding in. "Show me." Margaret unzipped the bag partially, revealing the neat stacks of cash and the edge of a manila envelope. Rodriguez whistled low under his breath. "Jesus, how much?" "2 million, give or take. But the money isn't the worst part." She pulled out the envelope and handed it to him. "These photos, they're recent, Rodriguez. The blood is still fresh in some of them." Rodriguez opened the envelope and his face went pale as he flipped through the images. "Christ almighty, these are cartel execution photos, professional grade, meant to send a message." He looked up sharply. "You said you found this in a storage unit?" David turned in his seat. "Unit 247 at Secure Store on Maple. We bought it at auction 3 days ago. It was supposed to be full of backpacks for our resale business." "And it was," Margaret added. "Hundreds of them, all empty. This bag was buried underneath, wrapped in plastic sheeting. Rex found it." Rodriguez was quiet for a long moment, studying the photos again. "These faces, I recognize some of them from missing persons reports. This one here," he held up a particularly brutal image, "Maria Santos. She disappeared 6 weeks ago. Her family's been calling the station every day." Margaret felt sick. "So these aren't just scare tactics. These are actual murders." "Execution-style killings," Rodriguez confirmed. "Which means whoever owns this bag isn't just moving drugs. They're eliminating witnesses, competitors, anyone who gets in their way." He looked directly at Margaret. "And now they know you have their insurance policy." "Insurance policy?" "Think about it. You don't keep photos like this for fun. These are leverage, proof of what happens to people who cross them, evidence of their power. Someone in the organization was keeping these as backup, probably against their own bosses." David's knuckles were white on the steering wheel. "So we're caught in the middle of a cartel power struggle." "Worse than that," Rodriguez said. "Whoever had this unit probably got themselves killed for stealing from the organization. Now you're the ones holding their blackmail material." Margaret's phone buzzed with a text message. Her blood ran cold as she read it aloud. "We know where you sleep. Return what's ours." Rodriguez grabbed the phone. "When did this come in?" "Just now." Margaret's voice was steady, but David could see her hands shaking. "How did they get my number?" "Same way they got your address. These people have resources. Corrupt cops, hackers, informants everywhere." Rodriguez was already pulling out his own phone. "I'm calling this in. We need to get you into protective custody immediately." "Wait." Margaret grabbed his arm. "What if there are leaks in your department? What if calling this in gets us killed faster?" Rodriguez paused, his finger hovering over the dial button. "Margaret, I've known you for 15 years. I trust you with my life. But you can't handle this alone. These aren't street dealers. This is organized crime with military-grade weapons and unlimited resources." Another text came through on Margaret's phone. "You have 24 hours. 24 hours for what?" David asked, reading over her shoulder. Rodriguez closed the phone without making the call. "They want their property back, but they also can't let you live knowing what you've seen. Those photos implicate powerful people. Even if you return everything, you're still loose ends." Margaret stared at the duffel bag, her mind racing through possibilities. "What if we don't run? What if we use this against them instead?" "Margaret, no," David said immediately. "These people murder families. They don't negotiate." But Rodriguez was studying her face, recognizing the expression he'd seen countless times during their years working together. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking," Margaret said slowly, "that sometimes the best defense is a good offense. And right now we're holding all their cards." Margaret's hands trembled as she dialed Agent Rivera's number for the 3rd time in 10 minutes. Each call went straight to voicemail. The silence felt ominous, especially after their conversation yesterday about the photos matching victims from Operation Bloodline. She glanced at David, who was methodically checking every window lock in the house, while Kaiser paced restlessly between them. "Still nothing?" David asked, testing the sliding door that led to their back patio. "Dead air." Margaret set her phone down and rubbed her temples. 25 years with the DEA had taught her that when federal agents suddenly went dark, it usually meant one of two things. They were either deep undercover or something had gone very wrong. The doorbell rang, and all three of them froze. Kaiser's ears perked up, but he didn't bark, unusual for their typically vocal German shepherd. Margaret crept to the front window and peered through the blinds. A young woman in a FedEx uniform stood on their porch, holding a small package. "Expecting anything?" David whispered. Margaret shook her head. She watched the delivery woman check her scanner, then glance around the neighborhood with the casual efficiency of someone making routine stops. Everything looked normal, but Margaret's instincts screamed otherwise. "Leave it on the porch," Margaret called through the door. "Need a signature for this one," the woman replied cheerfully. Margaret's blood chilled. They rarely received packages requiring signatures, and never from companies they hadn't ordered from. She moved away from the window and grabbed David's arm, pulling him toward the back of the house. "We're leaving. Now. What about—" "Kaiser, come!" The dog immediately fell into step beside them as Margaret grabbed her service weapon from the bedroom safe. Years of training kicked in as she mentally mapped escape routes. The back fence led to the Hendersons' yard, then to the elementary school beyond. If they could reach her car parked 2 streets over at the grocery store, the doorbell rang again, followed by persistent knocking. "Mrs. Chen? Mr. Chen? I really need that signature." Margaret pressed her back against the hallway wall and motioned for David to stay low. The woman's voice had shifted slightly, less cheerful, more insistent. Through the kitchen window, Margaret spotted movement in their neighbor's yard. A man in dark clothing was positioned behind Mrs. Patterson's rose bushes, trying to look casual while clearly watching their house. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Answer the door." "We just want to talk." Margaret's training took over completely. She typed back, "Rivera knows everything. Whatever you're planning won't work." The response came immediately. "Agent Rivera is unavailable. Permanently." David saw her face go pale as she read the message. "What?" "We need to go. Right now." She pocketed the phone and moved toward the back door, but froze when she saw another figure near their rear fence. They were surrounded. Kaiser whined softly, sensing the tension. Margaret knelt beside him, her mind racing through options. The attic access was in the hallway closet. They could hide until police arrived, but who would call them? Her nearest neighbor was Mrs. Patterson, and she rarely left her house. "Mrs. Chen, I'm going to leave this package and go," the delivery woman called. "But you might want to open it soon. Time-sensitive contents." Margaret heard footsteps moving away from the front door, but she didn't trust it. Using her phone camera, she peered around the kitchen window frame. The fake delivery woman was walking back to a van parked across the street, but the man behind the rose bushes hadn't moved. A new text arrived. "Package contains a phone. Answer when it rings. You have 30 minutes to decide if you want to cooperate or join Agent Rivera." Margaret's jaw clenched. Rivera was either dead or captured, and these people, whoever they were, had tracked the money and photos back to her despite federal protection promises. The storage unit purchase had been a matter of public record, easily traced. "Can you get to the Hendersons' house without being seen?" she whispered to David. "Maybe through the basement window." "Do it. Call 911 from there. Tell them we have armed suspects surrounding our house and request immediate backup. I'm not leaving you." "David." Her voice carried the authority of 2 decades in law enforcement. "Someone needs to survive this to tell people what happened. That money came from somewhere, and those photos document real murders. If something happens to us, the investigation dies." Another text, 28 minutes. Margaret watched David reluctantly crawl toward the basement stairs, Kaiser following faithfully behind. She remained crouched in the kitchen, weapon drawn, calculating angles and sightlines. The house felt like a trap now, every window a potential entry point. Outside, she could hear engines starting, more vehicles arriving. Whatever they wanted, they were committed to getting it today. Margaret checked her ammunition and prepared to make the next 20 to 8 minutes count. The first sign of trouble came at 3:47 a.m. when Rex's low growl rumbled through the darkness. Margaret's eyes snapped open, her hand instinctively reaching for the Glock 19 on her nightstand. 23 years with the DEA had trained her body to respond before her mind fully processed the threat. "What is it, boy?" she whispered, slipping from bed as David stirred beside her. Rex stood rigid at the bedroom window, hackles raised, staring into the backyard. His ears were pinned forward in the way that meant business, not a raccoon or stray cat, but something that had triggered every protective instinct in his German Shepherd DNA. Margaret peered through the blinds. The motion sensor lights should have illuminated the entire yard, but they remained dark. Either they'd malfunctioned simultaneously or someone had deliberately disabled them. "Marg?" David's voice was thick with sleep. "Everything okay? Stay down." She kept her voice calm but firm. "Call 911. Tell them we have possible intruders." Her bare feet made no sound on the hardwood as she moved toward the window. Rex followed, his breathing controlled but alert. Through the gap in the blinds, she caught a flicker of movement near the storage shed where they'd temporarily stashed the remaining backpacks. A figure in dark clothing crouched beside the shed, working at something with their hands. Too far to make out details, but the person moved with practiced stealth, professional. This wasn't some random burglar looking for lawn equipment to steal. "Police are on their way," David whispered behind her. "ETA 8 minutes. 8 minutes might as well be 8 hours. Margaret's mind raced through tactical options. The house had good sightlines from the second floor, but also limited exit routes. If there was one person outside, there were probably others. The figure by the shed stood and moved toward the house with deliberate purpose. Margaret's blood chilled as she realized they weren't trying to break in. They were placing something against the foundation. "We need to move, now." She grabbed David's arm. "Back door, stay low. What about?" No time for questions. They crept down the hallway, Rex padding silently beside them. Margaret's tactical training kicked into overdrive, cataloging every shadow and potential threat. At the top of the stairs, she held up a hand and listened. Nothing from inside the house, but a soft scraping sound from the back patio confirmed her worst fear. Multiple intruders, coordinated approach, probably armed and definitely motivated by more than petty theft. She led them down the stairs, weapon ready, mind calculating angles and cover positions. The kitchen window offered a view of the backyard approach. 2 more figures moved across the lawn with military precision, heading for different entry points. "Kitchen door," she breathed to David. "When I say run, you go straight to the Henderson's house and don't look back. I'm not leaving you. This isn't a discussion." The soft click of someone testing the front door handle echoed through the house. Margaret's pulse hammered, but her hands remained steady. She'd been in worse situations during her DEA years, though none where David's life hung in the balance. Rex's ears swiveled toward the basement door. Margaret's stomach dropped. Smart operators would come from multiple directions simultaneously, front, back, and basement access through the storm doors she'd been meaning to reinforce. The faint sound of sirens reached her ears, still several minutes away. The intruders would hear them too and adjust their timeline accordingly. Whatever they'd come for, they'd escalate quickly now. A shadow passed by the kitchen window. Margaret raised her weapon, finger on the trigger, waiting for the right moment. The figure paused at the back door, and she caught a glimpse of tactical gear and what looked like an assault rifle. These weren't small-time criminals. They were professionals, probably cartel enforcers sent to recover their money and eliminate witnesses. The execution photos in that duffel bag suddenly made perfect sense. This was their calling card, their standard operating procedure. The basement door creaked open. "Run," Margaret whispered urgently to David. "Kitchen door now." But as David moved toward the exit, The back door exploded inward in a shower of splintered wood. A figure in tactical black burst through, weapon raised, scanning for targets. Margaret didn't hesitate. Her first shot caught the intruder center mass, dropping him instantly. Rex launched himself at a second figure appearing in the doorway, 80 pounds of protective fury meeting the threat head-on. "Go!" Margaret shouted over the chaos. Footsteps pounded up from the basement. The front door splintered. David fumbled with the kitchen door lock as Margaret spun toward the new threats, knowing they had seconds before being completely surrounded. The sirens grew louder, but not nearly loud enough. The abandoned warehouse squatted like a concrete tumor against the grey morning sky, its broken windows staring down at Margaret as she checked her weapon one final time. Rodriguez had chosen the location well, isolated, multiple exit points, and far enough from civilization that gunshots wouldn't immediately draw attention. "This feels like a trap," David whispered beside her, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel of their rental car. "It probably is," Margaret replied, scanning the perimeter through binoculars. "But it's also our best shot at ending this." She spotted movement in the third-floor window, a brief shadow that could have been Rodriguez or one of Vega's men. Either way, someone was already in position. Her phone buzzed. Another text from Rodriguez, "Come alone, north entrance. You have 5 minutes. Margaret showed David the message. "Stay here, if I'm not out in 30 minutes. "Absolutely not." David's voice carried the same stubborn tone she'd heard during their worst arguments. "We're in this together, remember?" Before Margaret could argue, another vehicle pulled into the lot, a black SUV with tinted windows that screamed law enforcement. Margaret's heart lurched as she recognized Agent Torres stepping out of the passenger seat, followed by 3 other federal agents. "Shit," she breathed. Rodriguez called in the cavalry. The agents spread out with military precision, taking tactical positions around the building. Torres spoke into his radio, and Margaret caught fragments of his transmission. "Subject in position. Maintain perimeter." Her phone rang. "Rodriguez." Slight change of plans, his voice was tense. "Vega's people showed up early. 3 vehicles, at least 8 men. They're inside waiting for you." Margaret processed this quickly. "You set me up." "I set up a controlled takedown. Torres has snipers positioned, and we've got enough backup to handle Vega's crew. But I need you to go in there and identify the money. Make it official." Through her binoculars, Margaret saw muzzle flashes in the warehouse windows. The shooting had started without her. "Change of plans," she told David, yanking open the car door. "We're leaving, now." But as David started the engine, another black SUV blocked their exit. This one wasn't federal. 3 men emerged, automatic weapons visible beneath their jackets. Margaret recognized the lead figure from the execution photos, Vega himself, his scarred face unmistakable. "Margaret Chen," Vega called out, his accented English carrying clearly across the parking lot. "You have something that belongs to me." Margaret stepped out of the car slowly, hands visible but ready to draw. "Last I checked, drug money belongs to whoever seizes it." Vega laughed, a sound like grinding glass. "You think this is about money? You killed my nephew, Marcus DeLeon. This is about family." The pieces clicked into place. Marcus DeLeon. She remembered the name from the case files, a mid-level distributor she'd helped take down 3 years ago. He'd been killed in prison, but she'd assumed it was gang-related. "I didn't kill anyone," Margaret said. "I just did my job." "Your investigation put him in Riverside Correctional. The Aryans there, they don't like Mexicans." 2 weeks later, Marcus was found with his throat cut. Vega's eyes burned with hatred. "My sister cried at his funeral. She made me promise." The gunfire from the warehouse had intensified. Torres and his team were engaged in a serious firefight, which meant Margaret was on her own out here. She could see David in her peripheral vision, slowly reaching under his seat where they'd hidden a backup weapon. "So this was never about the money," Margaret realized. "You've been hunting me specifically." The storage unit was bait. "Rodriguez told me you'd been asking questions about our operation. I needed you to come to me." Vega signaled to his men, who began flanking Margaret's position. But then you found the money, and Rodriguez got ambitious, thought he could use you to take down my entire organization. Margaret's tactical mind ran calculations. 3 armed men, at least 40 yards to the nearest cover, David still in the car but exposed. Her chances of getting them both out alive were slim. "The photos," she said, stalling for time. "You wanted me to see what happens to people who cross you." "Exactly. Fear is a better weapon than bullets, usually, but you kept pushing, kept involving the federales." Vega raised his weapon. "Now I have to be more direct." The shot came from behind Margaret. David had found an angle through the car window. Vega's left shoulder exploded in red, spinning him around. Margaret drew and fired twice, dropping the man to her right. The third gunman dove behind his SUV, returning fire. Margaret rolled behind their rental car as bullets shattered the windshield. David was bleeding from glass cuts but still moving. In the warehouse, the gunfire was tapering off. Either Torres had won or everyone was dead. "Can you drive?" Margaret shouted to David. "Better than I can shoot," he replied, already sliding into the driver's seat. Margaret laid down, covering fire, as David reversed hard, tires screaming against asphalt. In the side mirror, she saw Vega struggling to his feet, his face twisted with rage and pain. This wasn't over. The abandoned warehouse loomed against the grey dawn sky like a concrete tombstone. Margaret crouched behind a rusted shipping container, her breath forming small clouds in the cold air as she watched 3 black SUVs pull into the loading dock area. Her phone buzzed with a text from Detective Rodriguez. "SWAT team in position. Do not engage until we give signal." She'd been here for 2 hours already, having arrived well before the scheduled meet. The cartel had been specific in their instructions. Bring the money and photos to Pier 47, Building C at 6 a.m. Come alone. What they didn't know was that Margaret had spent the last 3 days working with Rodriguez to turn their trap into a counter-operation. The German shepherd pressed against her leg, his body tense but silent. She'd insisted on bringing Kaiser despite Rodriguez's protests. The dog had started this whole nightmare by finding that duffel bag, and his nose might prove invaluable if things went sideways. Car doors slammed in the distance. Margaret counted 6 figures emerging from the vehicles, their movements coordinated and professional. Even from her position 50 yards away, she could see the bulge of weapons beneath their jackets. These weren't street-level dealers. This was cartel muscle, the kind of men who appeared in those execution photos. Her earpiece crackled softly. "Eyes on 6 targets," Rodriguez's voice whispered. "We've got snipers covering the exits and tactical teams flanking from the south and east. Remember, Margaret, you're just the bait. Let them make the first move." Margaret touched the replica duffel bag at her feet. It contained bundles of newspaper wrapped to look like cash stacks, with real hundreds on the outside layers. Hidden in the bottom were GPS tracking devices and a small camera. The photos were real. Rodriguez had convinced his captain that using them as evidence would be less valuable than stopping whatever operation was brewing. One of the cartel men stepped forward, clearly the leader. Even at this distance, Margaret recognized him from the surveillance photos Rodriguez had shown her. Carlos Mendoza, the Sinaloa cartel's West Coast distribution chief. A man with 14 confirmed kills and a reputation for creative violence. Mendoza pulled out a phone and dialed. Margaret's burner phone rang. "You see the building?" His voice carried a slight accent, deceptively calm. "I see it. Walk to the main entrance. Slowly. Any tricks, any backup, and your husband starts losing fingers." Margaret's blood turned to ice. "What are you talking about? He's safe." "Safe?" Mendoza's laugh was cold. "Richard Chen, 1247 Oak Street, currently sitting in his blue Toyota Camry outside Miller's hardware store, license plate 7 G4KNP. Our mutual friend, Detective Martinez, has been keeping him company for the last hour." The world tilted. Martinez, Rodriguez's partner who'd supposedly been investigating the storage unit connection. Margaret's mind raced as the betrayal hit her. Martinez had access to their safe house location, knew their entire operation plan. "I see understanding in your eyes," Mendoza continued. "Yes, we have friends everywhere. Now move." Margaret stood slowly, Kaiser beside her. Into her earpiece she whispered, "Rodriguez, Martinez is dirty. They have my husband." Static answered her. Then Mendoza's voice came through the earpiece instead of the phone. "Detective Rodriguez is temporarily indisposed. You're alone now, Margaret Chen." The warehouse felt like a cathedral of shadows as she approached the entrance. Her DEA training kicked in. Assess exits, identify cover, count hostiles, stay calm. But underneath the professional evaluation, terror for Richard's safety gnawed at her composure. The main door stood open. Margaret stepped inside, Kaiser's claws clicking on the concrete floor. Shafts of morning light slanted through dirty windows, illuminating a vast space filled with empty pallets and abandoned machinery, perfect for disposing of bodies. "Stop there!" Mendoza's voice echoed from somewhere ahead. She could see 3 men positioned around the warehouse, one by a side exit, 2 flanking what looked like a makeshift office area built from shipping containers. "The bag," Mendoza called. "Slide it forward and step back." Margaret complied, pushing the duffel bag across the smooth concrete. One of the gunmen approached it cautiously, using a knife to cut it open. The newspaper filling spilled out, obviously fake. Disappointing, Mendoza emerged from behind a concrete pillar, his pistol trained on her chest. "But not unexpected. We knew you'd never come alone willingly. What do you want?" Margaret kept her voice steady. "What we've always wanted. Our property back. The real money, plus the names of everyone who's seen it. Your federal friends seem to think they can disrupt our operations with their little task force. They're wrong." Kaiser growled low in his throat, sensing the danger. Margaret's hand found his collar, feeling the small emergency transmitter Rodriguez had attached there, assuming Rodriguez was still alive to receive the signal. "Here's what happens next," Mendoza continued, stepping closer. "You're going to call your handlers and arrange a proper exchange. Real money, real photos, and a guarantee that this investigation disappears. Otherwise, your husband's body joins our photo collection." The safe house felt like a prison wrapped in federal protection. Margaret paced the small living room for the 100th time, her bare feet silent on the worn carpet. 3 days of waiting had stretched her nerves thin as wire. David sat at the kitchen table, methodically cleaning his service weapon, a ritual that had become his anchor in the uncertainty. "They should have moved by now," Margaret muttered, stopping at the window. The blinds were drawn, but she could sense the unmarked car stationed across the street. Agent Rodriguez had assured them the surveillance was for their protection, but it felt more like house arrest. David looked up from his Glock. "The Bureau knows what they're doing, Maggie. These things take time." "Time we don't have." She turned from the window, frustration radiating from every gesture. "Every hour we sit here, Vasquez's people are adjusting their plans. They know we're cooperating." The burner phone Rodriguez had given them buzzed against the coffee table. Margaret grabbed it before the second ring. "Chen, we've got movement." Rodriguez's voice was tight with controlled excitement. Surveillance teams picked up 3 vehicles heading toward the storage facility. "Looks like they're finally making their play." Margaret's pulse quickened. "Are you moving in?" "Tactical teams are in position. We're letting them get inside first. Need them to access whatever they're after. That's our evidence." Through the phone, Margaret heard the crackle of radio chatter in the background. The weight of 18 months of investigation was about to come to a head, and it had all started with a $10 storage unit auction. "What about the money laundering operation?" David asked, leaning closer to the phone. "That's the beauty of this," Rodriguez replied. "The storage unit was just one spoke in the wheel. We've been watching their financial network for weeks. Once they move on the facility, we trigger simultaneous raids on 4 locations across the city." Margaret felt a familiar surge of adrenaline. The same rush she'd experienced during her DEA days when a major operation was about to break wide open. But this time, she wasn't wearing a badge or bulletproof vest. She was just a civilian who'd stumbled into something bigger than she could have imagined. "I want updates," she said. "Real time." "Margaret." "Don't Margaret me, Rodriguez. This started with my discovery. I've earned the right to know how it ends." A long pause. "Then I'll call you when we have them in custody. Stay put until then." The line went dead. Margaret stared at the silent phone, every instinct screaming at her to be in the field instead of hiding in a safe house. David holstered his weapon and moved to her side. "You know he's right. This isn't our fight anymore." "Isn't it?" Margaret's voice carried an edge of steel. "They came to our house, David. They threatened us. They killed that informant because of information we uncovered." She thought about the execution photos they'd found in the duffel bag, graphic evidence of what happened to people who crossed the cartel. The images had haunted her sleep for days. "Besides," she continued, "I know that storage facility better than any federal agent. I spent hours there going through units. I know the layout, the hiding spots, the ways in and out." David recognized the look in her eyes. After 32 years of marriage, he knew when Margaret Chen had made up her mind about something. It was the same expression she'd worn when she'd decided to join the DEA, the same determination that had made her one of their most effective agents. "What are you thinking?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew. Margaret moved to the bedroom and returned with her old tactical vest, a remnant from her federal days that she'd never been able to throw away. The Kevlar was worn but still functional. "I'm thinking," she said, strapping on the vest, "that 20 years of experience doesn't just disappear because you retire." David watched her check the Sig Sauer she'd retrieved from their gun safe before leaving the house. Her movements were precise, professional, muscle memory taking over. "This is insane," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Probably." Margaret tucked the weapon into her waistband. "But I didn't spend 2 decades hunting drug dealers to sit on the sidelines when the biggest bust of my career is going down." She moved toward the door, then paused. "I'm not asking you to come with me." David was already reaching for his jacket. "Like hell you're doing this alone." Outside, the unmarked surveillance car sat empty. Through the windshield, Margaret could see the 2 agents inside, their attention focused on radio communications. Whatever was happening at the storage facility had everyone's full attention. Margaret smiled grimly as she and David slipped out the back door. After 3 days of feeling helpless, it was time to take control. The storage facility was 15 minutes away, and Margaret Chen was going home. The sound of gravel crunching under tires sent Margaret's heart into overdrive. She pressed herself against the kitchen window, peering through the gap in the curtains as headlights swept across their driveway. The digital clock on the microwave read 2:47 a.m. "David," she whispered urgently, shaking her husband awake. "Someone's here." He bolted upright, instantly alert. Zeus lifted his massive head from his bed in the corner, ears pricked forward, a low rumble building in his chest. The headlights cut out, plunging the front yard back into darkness. Margaret strained to see through the shadows, but whoever had arrived was keeping to the periphery of their property, just beyond the reach of the motion sensors. "How many?" David asked, pulling on his jeans. "Can't tell. 1 vehicle, maybe 2 people. Margaret was already moving toward their bedroom closet, retrieving her service weapon from the biometric safe. The familiar weight of the Glock in her hands brought a measure of comfort, muscle memory from 20 years of fieldwork flooding back. David grabbed his shotgun from behind the dresser. "Back door?" "Covered. I had Rodriguez position units on Maple Street." Margaret checked her phone. No messages from the surveillance team. That either meant nothing was happening on their end, or something had gone very wrong. Zeus padded silently to the front window, his hackles rising. A barely audible whine escaped his throat, the sound he made when he detected something dangerous that his humans couldn't yet perceive. Margaret's phone buzzed. "Unknown number." "Answer it," David said. Keep them talking while I get eyes on their position." She swiped to accept the call but said nothing. Margaret Chen. The voice was calm, professional, with just a hint of an accent she couldn't place. "You have something that belongs to my employer. I think you have the wrong number." A soft chuckle. "The photographs, Agent Chen. The ones your dog found along with the money. We need those back." Margaret's blood turned to ice. They knew about Zeus. They knew exactly what had been in that duffel bag, which meant they'd been watching longer than anyone had realized. "I don't know what you're talking about. Please don't insult my intelligence. We know you turned the cash over to your former colleagues, but the photos, those weren't mentioned in any official reports. That suggests you kept them. Very wise, actually. They're quite valuable to the right people." David had disappeared into the hallway, moving toward the back of the house. Margaret could hear him checking windows, ensuring the perimeter was secure. "What makes you think I have any photos?" "Because you're still alive, Agent Chen. If you had turned over everything to the DEA, you would already be dead. The photos are your insurance policy, just as they were Luis Vega's. Unfortunately for Luis, he got careless." Margaret's mind raced. Luis Vega, she'd seen that name in the case files Rodriguez had shared. A mid-level trafficker who'd turned up dead in Phoenix 3 weeks ago, tortured for information before being executed. "I'm listening. Smart woman. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to bring the photos to the old railway bridge on Canyon Road. Come alone and bring your dog. My employer has developed quite an interest in him." The line went dead. Margaret's hands trembled as she processed what she'd just heard. They wanted Zeus. The thought of these animals getting their hands on her dog sent rage coursing through her veins. "David!" she called softly. He reappeared moments later, his expression grim. "2 men by the tree line, eastern perimeter. They're not making any move to approach, just watching. It's a demonstration. They want me to know they can get to us whenever they choose." Margaret quickly filled him in on the phone call. David's jaw tightened. "We're not doing this their way." "Agreed, but we need to make them think we are." Margaret was already formulating a plan. They know about the photos because they know Luis had them, which means those images contain something worth killing for. What kind of something? The kind that could bring down an entire operation. Faces, locations, maybe evidence of law enforcement corruption. She moved to the kitchen, keeping low beneath the window line. "I need to call Rodriguez, but not from here. They might be monitoring our communications." Zeus padded over to her, pressing his warm bulk against her legs. The gesture was both comforting and heartbreaking. He had no idea these people wanted to use him, probably as leverage or worse. "We get the photos from the safe deposit box," Margaret said, her voice hardening with resolve. "But we're not trading them for our lives. We're going to end this." David nodded grimly. "How? By giving them exactly what they want. Just not the way they expect it." Outside, one of the watchers shifted position, a brief shadow moving between the trees. Margaret smiled coldly. "Let them watch. By tomorrow night, this would all be over." The warehouse district stretched before them like a concrete graveyard, its empty loading docks and broken windows casting jagged shadows in the pre-dawn darkness. Margaret pressed herself against the cold brick wall, her breath forming small clouds in the frigid air as she watched 3 black SUVs circle the perimeter of Building 47 like predators stalking prey. Rodriguez was right, she whispered into her radio. "They're here." Agent Morrison's voice crackled back through her earpiece. "Count?" Margaret squinted through her binoculars, tracking movement between the vehicles. At least 8, maybe more inside the building. They're being careful. This isn't their first rodeo. From her position on the warehouse roof across the street, she had a clear view of the operation unfolding below. The cartel soldiers moved with military precision, establishing a security perimeter while 2 men approached the main entrance. Even from this distance, she recognized the distinctive limping gait of Eduardo Vasquez. Her phone buzzed with a text from David. "Police just left. House secure. Max and I safe." Relief flooded through her, followed immediately by a surge of cold fury. These animals had violated her home, threatened her family, turned her life upside down, all for money that was never really theirs to begin with. Tonight, that ended. "Margaret, you need to pull back," Morrison's voice urged through the radio. "Let the tactical team handle the breach." "Negative. I know these players better than anyone on your team. Vasquez is smart. He'll have an escape route planned. Someone needs to cut him off." She watched as two more vehicles approached from the east, their headlights sweeping across the empty lot. The cavalry had arrived, but they were maintaining their distance, waiting for her signal. The plan was surgical: surround the building, cut off all exits, then move in fast before the cartel could destroy whatever evidence they'd come to retrieve. Margaret slipped down the fire escape, her boots silent on the metal rungs. The months of forced retirement had made her soft around the edges, but muscle memory kicked in as she moved through the shadows, every sense heightened, every nerve firing with the familiar cocktail of adrenaline and focused calm she'd missed more than she cared to admit. The side entrance to Building 47 stood unguarded, an oversight that spoke to either arrogance or desperation. Margaret picked the lock with practiced efficiency, easing the door open just wide enough to slip inside. The warehouse reeked of motor oil and decay, its vast interior broken up by concrete pillars and abandoned machinery that cast twisted shadows in the dim light filtering through grimy windows. Voices echoed from the far end of the building, speaking rapid Spanish. Margaret crept closer, using the industrial debris as cover, until she could make out the conversation. "Told you this was too risky," someone was saying. "The DEA knows about this place. We clean it out tonight and disappear," Vasquez replied, his voice carrying the authority of command. "After we deal with the woman who started this mess." Margaret's blood chilled. Even with police protection, even with David and Max safely hidden, these people wouldn't stop hunting her family. They couldn't afford to let her live with what she knew. A metallic scraping sound echoed through the warehouse as the men began prying up sections of the concrete floor. Hidden beneath were metal containers, each one large enough to hold millions in cash or drugs. The storage unit had been just the tip of the iceberg. This warehouse was their real distribution hub. Margaret keyed her radio, speaking barely above a whisper. "They're excavating something big. Southwest corner, coordinates Sierra 7. Multiple containers buried in the floor. Copy that. Teams moving into position now." Through a gap in the machinery, Margaret watched Vasquez direct his men with calm efficiency. Even facing exposure and arrest, he showed no signs of panic. That made him dangerous in ways that went beyond simple violence. A sudden commotion near the main entrance drew everyone's attention. Shouts erupted in Spanish as one of the lookouts reported movement outside. Vasquez barked orders, and his men immediately began covering the excavated containers with tarps, preparing to abandon the operation. Margaret realized the tactical team had been spotted. In minutes, the cartel soldiers would scatter like roaches when the lights came on, and Vasquez would disappear back into the shadows to plan his next move against her family. She couldn't let that happen. Moving quickly but quietly, Margaret worked her way around the perimeter of the warehouse, positioning herself between Vasquez and the rear exit she'd spotted earlier. The smart play would be to wait for backup, let the professionals handle it by the book. But when she saw Vasquez pull out his phone and start dialing, probably calling his backup plan into motion, including whatever team he'd assigned to deal with her husband, Margaret threw the book out the window. Some fights you had to finish yourself. She stepped out of the shadows, gun drawn, and called out across the warehouse floor, "Eduardo Vasquez, DEA, nobody moves." The abandoned warehouse loomed against the storm-darkened sky like a concrete tomb. Margaret pressed her back against the rusted exterior wall, feeling every heartbeat thunder in her chest as rain pelted her face. Through the cracked window beside her, she could see the warm glow of lights inside and the silhouettes of at least 4 men moving around what appeared to be a makeshift command center. David crouched beside her, water streaming from his hair. "This is insane," he whispered. "We should wait for backup." "There is no backup," Margaret replied, checking her service weapon one more time. "Rodriguez is dead, And we don't know how deep this corruption goes. For all we know, half the task force could be on Vargas's payroll. She thought of Detective Rodriguez's body in that motel room, of the look of betrayal frozen on his face. Someone had fed information to the cartel, someone who knew exactly where Rodriguez would be, the same someone who had probably told Vargas about the storage unit investigation. Thunder rumbled overhead as Margaret studied the warehouse layout. Two entrances visible from their position, a loading dock on the east side and a personnel door on the south wall. Too many blind spots, too many ways this could go wrong. But somewhere inside that building was the evidence that could bring down Vargas's entire operation, and more importantly, their best chance of ensuring she and David lived to see morning. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number: "We know you're here. Come inside alone or your husband dies first." Ice formed in Margaret's veins. She showed David the message, watching his face pale in the dim light. "How do they—" David started, then stopped as they heard the distinctive sound of vehicle doors slamming shut somewhere behind the warehouse. "Jesus, Margaret, they're surrounding us." She grabbed his arm, pulling him toward the loading dock. "Not if we move first." They sprinted across the open ground, Margaret's old tactical training kicking in as she scanned for threats. The loading dock stood partially open, revealing a yawning darkness beyond. She could hear voices now, speaking in rapid Spanish, the words echoing off concrete walls. Margaret flattened herself beside the opening and listened. 3 distinct voices, maybe 4. One she recognized, the smooth, educated tone of Eduardo Vargas himself. He was here, personally overseeing whatever operation they had stumbled into. "The Chen woman was DEA for 15 years, Vargas was saying. "She knows how to disappear, how to hide evidence. We cannot afford loose ends." Another voice, rougher. "What about the husband? Kill them both. Make it look like a robbery gone wrong. Search the body for any additional storage unit keys or receipts." Margaret's blood ran cold. They weren't just trying to recover their money, they were tying up loose ends, eliminating everyone who could connect them to the storage facility operation. She thought of Mrs. Patterson, the elderly storage unit manager who had sold them the unit. How many other innocent people were on Vargas's cleanup list? David squeezed her shoulder, pointing to their left. Through a gap in the warehouse siding, she could see the outline of another building about 50 yards away. If they could reach it without being spotted, they might have a chance to circle around and— The sudden beam of a flashlight cut through the darkness, sweeping toward their position. Margaret grabbed David's hand and rolled under the loading dock door, pulling him into the warehouse just as footsteps crunched through gravel outside. They found themselves in a vast, dimly lit space filled with shipping containers and wooden crates. The air smelled of motor oil and something else, something chemical and sharp that made Margaret's nose burn. In the center of the warehouse, harsh work lights illuminated an area where several men stood around a table covered with maps and photographs. Eduardo Vargas stood with his back to them, gesturing at something on the table. Even from a distance, Margaret could see he was wearing an expensive suit, looking more like a corporate executive than a cartel boss. The disconnect was chilling. This wasn't some street thug, but a businessman who happened to traffic in death. "The distribution network stretches from here to Phoenix," Vargas was explaining to his men. 30 storage facilities, each one carefully selected for minimal security and maximum accessibility. The Chen incident threatens all of it. Margaret counted 4 men total, all armed. Bad odds, but she had faced worse during her DEA years. What worried her more were the shipping containers. In her experience, cartels didn't use warehouses just for meetings. This looked like a processing and distribution center. That meant more men, more weapons, and probably enough drugs to put everyone involved away for life. David pointed to a stack of crates that would provide cover and a better view of the operation. They began moving carefully through the shadows, staying low and avoiding the pools of light. Each step felt like an eternity, every creak of the old building amplified in Margaret's ears. They were halfway to the crates when Margaret's foot caught something metallic, sending it skittering across the concrete floor. The voices stopped instantly. The warehouse district felt like a graveyard at 3 in the morning, shadows stretching between industrial buildings like fingers reaching for the dead. Margaret crouched behind a shipping container, her breath forming small clouds in the cold air as she watched the black SUVs pull up to the designated building. Her earpiece crackled softly. "Visual on 4 vehicles," Agent Torres whispered from his position across the street. "Count 12 subjects, maybe more." Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs. After 20 years with the DEA, she thought she'd left this kind of adrenaline rush behind. The weight of her service weapon felt both foreign and familiar in her grip. "Remember, we need Vasquez alive," came Detective Morrison's voice through the comm. "He's our only link to the entire operation." Through her binoculars, Margaret watched as figures emerged from the vehicles. Even in the dim light, she recognized the man from the cartel photos, Eduardo Vasquez, moving with the confident swagger of someone who believed he controlled every variable. He had no idea that Margaret and David's panicked phone call about wanting to return the money had been a carefully orchestrated trap. "Where's the backup money?" David's voice came through her earpiece. He was positioned inside the building with Detective Morrison and 2 other officers, playing his role as the terrified civilian who'd stumbled into something too big for him. Margaret had fought against him being part of the operation, but Morrison was right. Vasquez would smell a trap if David wasn't present. The cartel leader had been burned too many times to trust anyone completely. "Movement on the east side," Torres reported. 3 more subjects, armed, taking positions. Margaret shifted her angle and spotted them, sentries positioning themselves to cover escape routes. These weren't street-level dealers. This was a professional crew that had survived in one of the most dangerous businesses on Earth. The slightest mistake would turn this warehouse into a killing field. Through the building's broken windows, she could see David standing next to a folding table where they'd arranged stacks of the cartel money. Her husband's face was pale but determined. Beside him, Morrison wore civilian clothes and held himself like a nervous accountant. The other officers were hidden in the shadows, but Margaret knew they were there, weapons trained on the entry points. "They're moving in," Torres whispered. The warehouse's main door creaked open, and Vasquez entered with 4 heavily armed men. Margaret could hear their voices now, echoing in the vast space. "You have caused me considerable inconvenience," Vasquez said, his accented English carrying clearly in the cold air. "People who inconvenience me usually end up in those photographs you found." David cleared his throat, playing his part perfectly. "Look, we never meant for any of this to happen. We just want to give you your money back and forget we ever saw it." Unfortunately, forgetting is not an option. Vasquez approached the table, examining the cash. "You have involved law enforcement. Did you think I would not discover this?" Margaret's blood turned to ice. Morrison's voice hissed through the comm. "Abort! Move in now!" But before anyone could react, Vasquez pulled out a phone and showed David the screen. Even from her distance, Margaret could see it was a photograph, their house, with police vehicles parked outside. "Your neighbors are very observant," Vasquez continued. "They noticed unusual activity. Federal agents are not as invisible as they believe." The warehouse erupted into chaos. Margaret kicked open the side door she'd been positioned near, shouting, "DE, drop your weapons!" as muzzle flashes lit up the darkness like deadly fireflies. David dove behind a concrete pillar as bullets sparked off the metal table. Morrison and his team emerged from their hiding spots, returning fire at the cartel soldiers who had spread out across the warehouse floor. Margaret moved through the maze of abandoned machinery, trying to get a clean shot at Vasquez, who had taken cover behind a support beam near the back exit. One of his men appeared around a corner, assault rifle raised, and Margaret put 2 rounds center mass without hesitation. Muscle memory from 1,000 training scenarios took over, her body moving with deadly precision. "Vasquez is moving to the rear exit," Torres shouted over the gunfire. Margaret sprinted across open ground, bullets whining past her head, and reached the back of the warehouse, just as Vasquez burst through the emergency door. She followed him into the alley, where his escape vehicle was waiting, engine running, driver ready. "Eduardo Vasquez, you're under arrest," she called out, weapon trained on his center mass. He turned, his own gun rising, and for a split second they faced each other across 15 feet of empty space, the veteran DEA agent and the cartel executioner who had turned her retirement into a nightmare. The shots came simultaneously, muzzle flashes illuminating the alley like lightning. Margaret felt something hot tear across her shoulder as she dove behind a dumpster. When the echo faded, Eduardo Vasquez lay motionless on the asphalt, his weapon scattered 3 feet away. The warehouse smelled of rust and motor oil, its cavernous space broken only by shafts of pale morning light filtering through grimy windows. Margaret crouched behind a stack of shipping containers, her Glock steady in her hands as she watched Ramirez's men position themselves around the perimeter. Tom was 50 yards to her left, hidden behind an old forklift, while Detective Santos coordinated the tactical team from the building's rear entrance. The plan was simple. Let Ramirez arrive, confirm his confession on the wire Margaret wore, then move in for the arrest. But Margaret knew from 20 years with the DEA that simple plans rarely survived contact with desperate criminals. Her earpiece crackled softly. "Target vehicle approaching," Santos whispered. "Black Escalade, 2 follow cars." Margaret's pulse quickened. Through a gap in the containers, she watched the warehouse's main door slide open. Ramirez entered alone, his expensive suit incongruous against the industrial backdrop. He moved with the confidence of a man who believed he controlled every variable. "Mrs. Chen," Ramirez called out, his voice echoing in the vast space. "I know you're here. Let's finish this business." Margaret stepped into view, keeping her weapon low but ready. "Just me and you, like we agreed." Ramirez smiled, but his eyes remained cold. "You've caused me considerable trouble. That money belongs to people who don't forgive easily." "The Valdez cartel?" Margaret kept her voice steady, knowing every word was being recorded. "Is that who you've been laundering for?" Laundering is such an ugly word. Ramirez began walking slowly toward her, hands visible but relaxed. "I prefer financial consulting." The storage unit network was elegant, hundreds of locations, legitimate businesses as fronts, cash moving through the system like clockwork. Margaret felt a chill of recognition. The backpacks. They weren't just storage. You were using them to transport cash through legitimate channels. Very good. Soccer tournaments, school trips, youth programs. Who suspects children's sports equipment? The network generated 50 million annually before your unfortunate discovery. Behind Ramirez, Margaret caught movement. More figures emerged from the shadows, not his usual security detail, but harder-looking men with military bearing and automatic weapons. Her earpiece erupted with urgent whispers, multiple armed hostiles, north entrance. Ramirez noticed her expression change. "Did you really think I'd come here defensively? The Valdez organization has invested heavily in my operations. They're quite protective of their assets." The trap was closing. Margaret keyed her emergency signal, a subtle pressure on her earpiece that would alert Santos to move immediately, but she needed more from Ramirez, needed him to implicate himself completely. "What about Detective Morrison? Did the cartel order that hit?" Ramirez's composure cracked slightly. Morrison was getting too close, asking questions about storage facilities near the border. Sometimes permanent solutions become necessary. "So you had him killed." "I protected the operation, just as I'm protecting it now." Gunfire exploded from the warehouse's rear section, Santos's team engaging Ramirez's backup forces. The sound reverberated like thunder off the metal walls. Ramirez drew a pistol, but Margaret was already moving, diving behind the nearest container as bullets sparked off steel. Her training kicked in: assess, adapt, survive. Tom's position was compromised. She could see muzzle flashes from 3 directions pinning him down. "Santos, we need that exit route now." "Working on it. Heavy resistance at the back." Margaret Leopard crawled between containers, using the chaos to get closer to Ramirez's position. The cartel soldiers were professionals, but they'd underestimated the preparation time Santos's team had inside the warehouse. Flashbang grenades detonated in sequence, temporarily disrupting the attackers' coordination. She reached Tom's position as he reloaded behind the forklift. Blood seeped through his jacket sleeve. "How bad?" she asked. "I'll live." "Where's Ramirez?" A new sound cut through the gunfire. Helicopter rotors. Through the skylight, Margaret saw an unmarked bird settling onto the warehouse roof. Ramirez's final escape plan. "He's running," she told Tom. "Cover me." Margaret sprinted across open ground as Tom laid down, suppressing fire. A rope dropped through the skylight, and Ramirez was already climbing toward freedom. She raised her Glock, but the angle was impossible with friendly forces below. Instead, she grabbed the rope as Ramirez reached the halfway point. The added weight threw off his rhythm. He looked down, eyes widening as Margaret climbed after him. 20 feet above the warehouse floor, they struggled on the swaying line. "It's over, Ramirez. Nothing's over. The organization is bigger than you imagine." His grip loosened, whether from fatigue or intention. Margaret couldn't tell. But as he fell, she caught his wrist with her free hand. Below them, the gunfire was subsiding. Santos's voice came through clearly. "Warehouse secure. All hostiles down or surrendering." Margaret looked into Ramirez's eyes as she held his life in her grip. "Who else? Give me names and I pull you up." Fear replaced arrogance in his expression. "Federal judges, prosecutors, half the Border Patrol supervisors. The list is in my safe. Combination is Sarah's birthday." She hauled him up as helicopters, legitimate ones this time, surrounded the building. The network was broken, but justice was just beginning.